Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Scott Veritas here with my co-host Ben Rebellis, and we are going to talk about the Republican presidential debate that took place last week. We usually record these over the weekend, this being no exception. This is actually a Friday night edition due to some scheduling conflicts of the Veritas Podcast. You've got us after dark. You've got Ben drinking. Do you want to tell everyone what that is, Ben?
That is a pumptini that is featured at Sir out in LA, a place I'm never going to go. And although I've been tried to be coerced into going, and it is delicious, and I'm happy about it.
Yeah. So Ben is drinking pink liquid from a martini glass for our audio listeners. And
it's Friday. Let's party.
To be fair, we were hanging out a couple weeks ago playing some video games, and I was imbibing on some pink lemonade mixed with blue raspberry vodka. So we only drink the manliest of drinks.
We are sophisticated drinkers
in the
podcast.
offices, in the virtual offices of the Veritas Podcast. We only drink the manliest drinks available.
Yeah.
But we are going to talk today, a little buzzed perhaps, at least in Ben's case, but we are going to talk about the Republican presidential debate that took place last week. It'll have been about a week since it happened when this episode comes out, but we do want to talk about it. I'm just going to go through the candidates one by one, and I'll throw it to you, Ben. I'm curious I'm sure that you maybe see some of the performances from the candidates a little bit differently than I did in some cases,
Sure.
But I'm going to start with a candidate who was not at the debate, Donald Trump, who also, I will say, had a very badass mugshot taken during his processing in Fulton County.
He is thugging that camera.
I saw a really good post about this on Twitter. I think it was Zero HP Lovecraft. He was saying that it felt like the media had disciplined themselves into not signal boosting Trump for a little while, and then they just totally lost that discipline here, because that mugshot, he did the smartest thing he could have done, which he made it his first tweet in 2.5 years. I don't want to talk about the Trump prosecution too much right now. I want to let it play out a little bit more. And we've talked about Trump being prosecuted a lot on the show because he keeps getting indicted
because it's happening a lot,
and it gets a little old, so we're not going to talk about it. But I will admit, even though everyone knows I'm ride or die for Ron DeSantis, and we'll get to that later, how he did in the debate or did not do, even though I am team DeSantis, I will absolutely concede, great mugshot, and what a great campaign ploy by the Trump campaign to be using that right now. He is certainly looking like the overwhelming front runner, and I want to talk about his lack of participation in the debate that took place last week before I get to the candidates who were in attendance. I think Donald Trump won the debate. And the reason is because he didn't go. He's the overwhelming front runner. And we're going to talk about the individual performances by the candidates, but no one particularly stood out at the debate. I think a lot more people know who Vivek Ramaswamy is after the debate, and that he did himself some favors by just having a very energetic performance. We'll talk about that in a bit. But no one really seemed like they were going to, break out, have their viral moment, take out another candidate the way that Tulsi Gabbard did to Kamala Harris in 2020, the way that Chris Christie did to Marco Rubio in 2016. Sometimes you can take it out another candidate, even if it doesn't help your candidacy that much. Last night, I don't think anyone disqualified themselves from the race, except for 3 candidates who were just so damn boring. Oh my God. And these are the next candidates I want to talk about. Donald Trump, I think he won by not attending. I will totally concede that no one did anything at the debate to overtake him.
But it's sad, I understand how it's a really good strategic move on his part to not participate. I get that. I get how it probably helps him, especially when he plans this mugshot for the day after, so he can take all of the wind out of any sails that for anybody that would have shown up. But it really is just another one of these examples of how democracy is so gameable. And he has gamed it by, shouldn't the person who's the number one front runner for the opposition party be saying what they think? And he's not. And, as much as I think that's good politics, in the sense that I hate politics, but it's good politics, but it's just kind of sad that that's the correct move.
It's when you have the kind of stranglehold over the base of a party that he has, it's just something you get to do. This is not something that, for as much as the Democratic base loved Bernie Sanders, he wasn't able to do this in either of his previous presidential campaigns. And Hillary Clinton, for as much as people thought she was the presumptive nominee in 2016, even she didn't have this power. This is a unique power that is unique to Donald Trump to be such an overwhelming frontrunner. He can, at least for now, ignore the debates. And as candidates drop out, and I want to talk about that in a second, because there's 3 people that I want out immediately. But as candidates drop out, he may have to answer the call to appear at these debates. I would really love to see a debate between my endorsed candidate, Ron DeSantis, and Donald Trump. I actually think Ron DeSantis would do much better in debates where there are fewer candidates, and we'll talk about his performance later. But it's just, I agree with you, Ben, that it is unfortunate for multiple reasons. Just on a pure entertainment level, the debate was very boring without Trump. It was not particularly interesting to watch. I didn't get that much out of my guy, Ron. I think he had a couple of okay moments. But really, I have to say, there were 5 candidates who, at least to me, felt like they belonged on the stage. There was something compelling about their candidacy. Those being DeSantis, obviously he's the second place candidate. Ramaswamy, who's kind of this come out of nowhere guy. Nikki Haley, who has a great resume, is obviously very qualified, who is the only woman in the race. Mike Pence, who I sort of think had to be at the first debate because he really needed to address what happened on January 6th. And I will go on a limb and say I actually kind of like Chris Christie. I know some people would put him in the also ran category, which he is according to his poll numbers, but there's something about Chris Christie I kind of like. But all those candidates I'm going to get to in a minute. There's 3 candidates I want to get out of the frickin' way. Tim Scott, Doug Burgum, and Asa Hutchinson. Go away. Oh my God. Every time any of those 3 were talking, I literally got to a point where I just muted it. I was like, wow, there is nothing interesting about these 3. It was about halfway through the debate. It's so canned. It's so uninteresting. They're never going to win the nomination. They're never even going to scratch the surface of Donald Trump's polling lead. I don't know why people like that run for president at this point. And there's just so much at stake, because there's always also rans, but there's so much at stake with this decision by the Republican Party of whether or not they're going to continue to ride with Trump, who obviously benefits from a larger field, that those 3 guys need to go. All I'll say about them is, especially Asa Hutchinson, but also Doug Burgum and Tim Scott, what are you doing? I don't know. I don't know, Ben, if you got anything out of those 3 candidates that I wasn't getting. Those 3 I was absolutely sick of after like 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, at the debate stage, I didn't think there was much going on. I think Burgum had gotten a little press recently. I know that I think he did Barry Weiss's podcast recently, and some people have spoken highly about him, about being a good person, a good leader. But I mean, it's probably too late at this point to be trying to make that surge. I mean, I know we're still in August. But I don't see that going anywhere. I think the 5 that you mentioned are the 5 that have any shot, maybe, of taking down the Trump, of stopping the Trump train.
Yeah, because there needs to be something compelling about you. I mean, Doug Burgum does seem like a nice guy, and I've seen him speak, and he seems like a nice guy. He did the debate on one leg. He had actually torn his Achilles in a pickup basketball game with his staff the previous day, apparently. He seems like a nice guy. He seems like a smart guy. I'm sure he's a good governor, and the people of North Dakota seem to like him very much. But when you're one of these candidates who's at 1% and you actually sneak into the debates, that's your shot. Do something crazy. Do something interesting. Get people to remember who you are. And he and Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas, and Tim Scott, just did nothing that made me or my girlfriend who was watching with me pause for a minute and go, oh, who is this guy? Whereas I would give some credit to Vivek Ramaswamy for doing that actually a lot over the course of the past couple months. He's actually polling in 3rd place right now. We might as well talk about him next. Okay. He was probably the most interesting part of the debate on the part of any one participant, because he had the most energy. He picked the most fights. He clearly wants to have the most bombastic presence outside of a Donald Trump at these debates. He's definitely taking some risks. He really was getting into it with Mike Pence at numerous points during the night. Vivek is a really interesting candidate because on paper, I'm supposed to like him. I'm like we talk about the culture war on this show. Vivek's all about the culture war. Here's my problem with Ramaswamy. I don't buy it. Something about his delivery does not ring true to me. He has this big Cheshire cat smile. He sounds kind of like a used car salesman. And I understand that he's a businessman who's made a lot of money. He is clearly very smart. He is very articulate. He is a good speaker. But there's this element of like, this guy's a sort of Johnny come lately. Like, was he talking about these things even a few months before he started running for president? I had never heard of him. It just comes off like some kind of weird publicity stunt, or like basically, I mean, Chris Christie called him Chat GPT, the candidate, because it does kind of feel like, and I thought that was a good line, because it feels like he says, what do figures like Scott Veritas like to tweet about on Twitter. And he put that into ChatGPT and he came out with some very generic talking points from the online right. And something about it doesn't seem genuine when it comes from Vivek. And I'll admit that he's intriguing. I think he should stay in the race for a while if he can modulate his delivery and make a case for why he's actually authentic. But even though on paper I should really like him, I think he's trying to go after people like me. It's not working, and I'm definitely still Team DeSantis after seeing Ramaswamy's performance. And he's playing a very high risk game, and I'll give him credit for that. A lot of people probably were turned off by his performance, kind of like I was, but I could see why he was there, and I was intrigued by his presence on the stage.
Yeah. So we might disagree a little bit. I was like, I knew about Vivek, which is Vivek like cake, I think is how he corrects people. Yeah. About Vivek, he wrote a book. He's written a couple of books. One of them is called Woke Inc. So he has been on this issue for a while. My thing with Vivek, and I disagree with him on a lot of things. He wants to like go to war with Mexico or something, which by the way was a position that was way too shared on the debate stage on Wednesday, that we're going to be doing forcible things to Mexico to get rid of fentanyl, which no, let's not do that. So I think with Vivek, though, is I've been kind of watching him over these last few months, and when he first kind of came out, and this could just be my limited exposure, he seemed like he had that authenticity you're looking for. He seemed like he had that genuineness that you're talking about. But as he's had to go through the Iowa State Fair, to go through like all of these different, he's gotten that politician stump speech. Like he's lost a little bit of that kind of thoughtfulness that I expected of him previously. And then he had this clash with Caitlin, I think it was Caitlin Collins on CNN, where she basically said, well, didn't you say this to the Atlantic? And he said, no, I never said that to the Atlantic. And then the Atlantic came out with the audio. And like, so he's doing the same politician shit of lying, of so that's really disappointing. I do agree he's doing a high risk thing. But he's also doing it in a way, and again, it's another thing I very much disagree with him on. He's doing a Trump light thing, and he's the one candidate who really is as much as close to Trump, or at least as much of an apologist as anyone else on that stage, and I don't like that about him. That being said, I really like Vivek's idea of getting rid of a lot of the three-letter agencies. He understands, and he's spoken forcefully on the problem of the administrative state, and I think he's totally right about that. And it is a very boring topic that he's trying to make a big deal of, and I'm almost 100% with him on that front.
Yeah, he's an interesting candidate, and I think he's one of the ones that I'd be excited to hear from at a debate where there are fewer participants, where there are closer to 5 participants. There were 8 last week. There have actually been some debates in recent memory where there were 10 or more candidates. So at least
I was actually I have that question down to ask you and what you think about that. Do you think what do you think the optimal size is for debates like this?
Honestly, 3 or 4. I mean, I think it's the same optimal size for the number of people in any conversation. I mean, you can have a very quality conversation with like 3 or 4 people. Once you have too many people, it's no longer really a conversation. It's kind of, like some people are going to have to pull back and some people are going to have to jump in for airtime. But then you have to accept the fact that people are, if you're getting a small amount of support, even if it's just 2% or more in the polls, the American people are entitled to hear from you, especially if you're a sitting statewide office holder, which Burgum and Hutchinson and Scott all are. But I am glad, and I'll tell this to the audience if they don't know, I am glad that the RNC actually has raised the polling threshold for the next debate. I don't know if you know this, Ben, but they raised it to 3%. So Hutchinson will not be at the next debate. There's no way he's going to hit that threshold. And Burgum is on the cusp of also not being in attendance at the next debate. Tim Scott would qualify. But if any of these candidates, including Chris Christie or Nikki Haley or anybody, runs out of money, they'll have to drop out. And that often does happen in the fall to a few candidacies. So I would love to see a debate where maybe it's, DeSantis, Vivek, maybe Trump will show up, and maybe Nikki Haley as sort of your establishment Republican stand-in. Let's talk about her next. Haley, I'm not really a Nikki Haley guy. I would say Nikki Haley is my fine candidate. I would be
Yeah.
absolutely fine with Nikki Haley as the Republican nominee. I would be very happy to vote for her over Joe Biden. I would be very
Yes.
happy to vote for her over pretty much any modern Democratic politician. I think she's clearly a smart lady. She is overqualified for the presidency. She is as qualified as you can be. She's an ambassador to the UN. She's a former governor who was very well liked in her state. She has some moderate bona fides and some conservative bona fides. She's I know that Tucker Carlson has like a big hate boner for her, which I've always thought was kind of funny. He really hates Nikki Haley, and a lot of people in the sort of new right do. I don't hate her. I'm not enthralled with her. I thought I did think she actually had a pretty good answer on abortion at the debate that intrigued my girlfriend and I, because we're, compared to most Republicans, relatively pro-choice. My position has always been that it should be broadly unrestricted in the first trimester and broadly restricted thereafter. And her debate performance, she made a point of saying, let's work within the realm of the possible when it comes to abortion and not try to pass a federal ban, at 6 weeks.
Sure.
And so I appreciated that from her, because to a sort of, more slightly more pro-choice conservative, I certainly don't support abortion the way the Democrats do. That was something I appreciated. Other than that, everything she did was just kind of like steady, and I would happily have this woman be my president, be the first woman president. It would be funny if it was a Republican woman of color. That I would kind of get a kick out of.
That would be fun.
The first woman of color, it would be all gone and it would be all Republicans to own. So I would kind of like that about Nikki Haley's candidacy, but I don't know what else there is to say about her. She is a very sure, fine, absolutely. Nothing wrong with that, but also not particularly intriguing kind of candidate for me.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add about that. She had a fine debate performance. She is a fine candidate. If she's the one up against Joe Biden, I'm happy to vote for her. I mean, I think she could probably push a theme of being kind of like what Joe Biden did, was push this adult in the room type of thing. The problem with the Republican Party is they don't seem to want an adult in the room.
No.
They seem to want a bull in a china shop, which, however justified or not that particular impulse is, she's not that. But if she's the candidate, I am happy to. Well, I'm going to vote for the Libertarian anyway, so it doesn't matter. But if she's the candidate against Joe Biden, I would not have any problems voting for her.
Yeah, she definitely could do that sort of adult in the room thing. And she could also be like, I can stand on my own 2 feet and remember who my grandchildren are and all of that. I don't even know if she is a grandma at this point, but
No idea.
she would definitely debate circles around Joe Biden, I think. And I think Nikki Haley would have a pretty good time in a general election. I'll definitely give her that. So I'll give her sort of a pass on a pass fail for now, that I'm fine with Nikki Haley. Next, I want to talk about Pence, and then we'll get to DeSantis, who was obviously the biggest candidate at the stage last night. Or actually, we didn't talk about Christie, who was physically the biggest candidate. But we'll talk about Pence for a minute. Mike Pence, I think, is very. He's not a bad debater, and he's not a terrible speaker. He is pretty boring, and I think that a big part of it is he is really reaching for this evangelical moral majority. He references God more than any other candidate and his faith more than any other candidate. And I actually believe on some level that it's genuine. He's been a Christian conservative for a very long time, and used to talk about that stuff on the radio, was famously, in the eyes of modern woke acolytes, famously homophobic during his time as governor of Indiana. But the thing is that I think he's reaching for something that isn't really there. I mean, Ben, you were talking about how the Republican Party, there's this saying that used to go around that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line. That kind of got flipped with Trump. And so whereas a candidate like Pence, who just sort of goes like, Christian conservatives, come with me, let's do the thing we've always done, Ronald Reagan, let's run it back again, let's make it the 1980s again, that could have worked in 2012. That's kind of, Mitt Romney was kind of like that, kind of a very run-of-the-mill generic conservative, although he was Mormon. He was not, although Mormons are a type of Christian. I don't even know what's going on with Mormonism, but in any case.
I don't know. I watched that. The only thing I know about Mormonism really is that one South Park
episode. Yeah, that's the only thing I know. But in any case, Pence, I thought that he needed to be at this one debate. And I would be very happy for him to drop out at this point, because I feel like he's siphoning off support from DeSantis to some extent. And he does get about 3 or 4% in the poll. So he's not a total non-factor because of his name ID. But he needed to be at this debate so that he could stand up for what he did on January 6th. And so that other people on stage could stand up for what he did on January 6, 2021, when he refused to follow an order from Donald Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 election. That was a very important moment. It was a moment that Mike Pence was entitled to have and needed to have before the American people. And I am actually very glad that he got to have that moment. I have some respect for Mike Pence. But I do think that now that he's had that moment, it would be a good time for him to drop out and endorse Ron DeSantis if he really does believe that his former boss, Donald Trump, is a threat to the republic, which it's pretty clear he does at this point, that he has a lot of resentment around that, but he likes to be mature about it and not let it become too personal. Because he did sing the praises of the Trump-Pence administration last night without going too hard on Trump, but obviously the threats he received from the president and the way he's been treated from the president have frayed that relationship, and I think rightfully so.
Yeah, Pence is not going to be the candidate. And the Pence is not going to be the candidate because of Trump. I mean, we can say that other people can come in and maybe do an attack on Trump, but Pence can't be that guy because Pence was his vice president. Pence was the one who defied him when it came to overturning election results. Like, Trump voters are not going to forgive Pence for that, and you're going to need Trump vote. You have to siphon off Trump voters to become the candidate here, and Pence is just not going to be the guy who does it.
Yeah, you have to, when a candidate is getting 55% of the vote like Trump and the next guy is 15% Ron DeSantis, you do have to cut into that to some extent. And candidates, I think, are having a very hard time differentiating themselves from Trump and showing why they're better than him in some ways, but also not completely alienating his base. This is a great transition because there is one candidate who there's actually, I will say there's two candidates that aren't even trying to go after Donald Trump's base at all. One of them is Asa Hutchinson, who's just boring as all hell, and I don't want to talk about. I said he should drop out, and he should. But the candidate who I think deserves to be, and also a Will Hurd, who wasn't in attendance at the debate because he didn't get enough
I don't know
polling.
who that is.
But some congressman who is also running as like an anti-Trump guy. But there's a few people running as just straight up anti-Trumps, and I feel like somebody deserves to have that mantle to be like, fuck Trump 100%. I don't give a shit. I don't want to curry favor with his people at all. I am the guy to vote for if you're a Republican who does not like Trump and expressly doesn't like him. Somebody deserves to carry that mantle, and I think it's pretty clear that person is Chris Christie. Absolutely. Chris Christie is, of the anti-Trumpers in the Republican Party, probably the most compelling at this point, and the most almost Trump-like in his delivery. I mean, Chris Christie has always been known as this kind of tough-talking New Jersey, big guy who is literally that kind of larger than life political figure that you wouldn't find out of place in a movie about like the 1950s New York, political machine. He is actually a pretty compelling figure. He was a rising star in the Republican Party for a very long time. And I thought at the debate, he showed why. Every time he talked, I did want to listen. There is something compelling about Chris Christie. He does seem to just have that it factor that it makes him more interesting than a generic Republican like Asa Hutchinson. So what I'll say about Chris Christie is he's not going to be the nominee. He's trying to basically say like, fuck Trump, vote for me. That's a fine stance to take. Somebody should probably be that candidate. I think Chris Christie deserves to be that candidate. He'll probably get like 3% of the vote doing that. But I will say that he gets a lot of flack. He gets made fun of a lot. But I will say that Chris Christie reminded me at the debate why he's always been more compelling than your average Republican, and why he's always been there, and why him endorsing Donald Trump in 2016 was so surprising. And he was one of the first establishment Republican figures to do that. And I think that I think I'd like to see him stay in the race for a little while longer. Of course, I want to see him drop out before votes actually start getting casted, because I do want more people to vote for Ron DeSantis, who we'll talk about in a second. But Chris Christie, I'm going to go out on a limb. I think the audience is not going to like this. I know that Chris Christie, I believe, has a higher approval rating among Democrats than he does among Republicans. He is very unpopular in the Republican Party. But I don't know. I think there's something genuine about Chris Christie's dislike for Trump. I think that there's something well-informed about it, and that he said something last week that I really appreciated, which is it's the president's job to level with people and tell the truth to them. And Chris Christie's always been this kind of tough talking, truth telling kind of guy. And I believe on some level that he does think that. And he's definitely flawed. He's had his issues. He's not a perfect guy, but I don't know. I'm going to go out on a limb. I know people would probably be surprised that I don't love Vivek, as I now know it's pronounced. But I think people might be even more surprised to know that I kind of have a little soft spot for Chris Christie. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I think Chris Christie is sharp. I think he's a great debater. I think he's probably a fine governor. The problem is that he's a piece of shit. And I'm sorry, I just cannot get over the Bridgegate thing. I cannot imagine in a world in which I used to commute every day that some motherfucker decided to mess up my commute to get back for some political purpose, like screwing over your own citizens for some political battle that they had nothing to do with. I'm sorry. I just thought that was like, and what it makes me wonder is if you're willing to do that kind of thing to just the average everyday citizen, what the hell else are you willing to do? Like, what is going on that we don't hear about? Like, I'm sorry, maybe this is just like an old thing that I thought was terrible at the time. I've never gotten over. And don't get me wrong, I have not kept track of Chris Christie's career. That one was just unforgivable for me.
Yeah, the 2013 Bridgegate scandal, it's been long enough that it doesn't always come up with Christie, but obviously this was part of what derailed his 2016 campaign. It kind of derailed his political career. My understanding of that has always been that he was fairly transparent with the authorities who were assigned to investigate that, and that several members of his staff, I think, went to jail.
Yeah.
And that he was acquitted of really having full and complete knowledge of what was going on. I don't know, Ben, if you know something I don't, but I've always kind of on that been like, my understanding was that some members of his staff unilaterally took revenge out on the mayor of Fort Worth by closing a bridge, and that, yeah, it was a terrible, terrible thing to do. And there's solid evidence that there was an ambulance with a dying woman on the bridge that day that did not make it to the hospital in time. But yeah, the Bridgegate thing, it's interesting. I remember he did like a 4-hour long press conference about it where he was just like trying to salvage, the flaming embers of his presidential ambitions. And he, to his credit, has run for president twice now. He almost ran in 2012 when a lot of people think he probably could have beaten Mitt Romney and been the candidate, and maybe even beaten Barack Obama and been elected president. But yes, the Bridgegate thing, definitely a worthy note if you're going to talk about Chris Christie.
Yeah, listen, if that's the case, if you're right that he didn't know anything, then I will apologize to Chris Christie because I know he's an avid listener of the Veritas Podcast. But I find it hard to believe. I mean, it's just like these common things, like when we try to do like white collar prosecutions, is like we can never get the guys at the very top because of how many layers of protection they have, and the people who are lower down can go to jail. If he didn't know, fine. I apologize. I'm sorry, Chris Christie, but I find that very hard to believe.
Well, he does. Look, Chris Christie's from New Jersey. I believe he's Italian. Who knows what kind of protection racket he's got going on, or what he could have been doing with those reporters. But in any case, there's a candidate who I believe is also of Italian descent that I want to talk about. He is my candidate. I endorsed him a long time ago. It's Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Ron is in second place in the polls. As of this point, he's still in second place in the polls, but it's a distant second. As recently as late last year, he actually was hitting about 35, 37% in the polls. He was really nipping at Trump's heels for a minute there.
Trump was I was listening to Matt Welch this week on the Fifth Column. You know what the big thing that changed that made that difference so much starker? The Alvin Bragg indictment.
I was just going to say, yeah, all the indictments have made it. Yeah, it's
particularly the Bragg one, though, because the Bragg one, I mean, who knows what would have happened if like Georgia came first or if the documents came first. But once those indictments came down, they just separated.
Yeah. Ron DeSantis was doing really well for an insurgent candidacy. He was in a very solid second place position. And then these indictments seem to have hurt that. His campaign since then has been made fun of a lot for the fact that Ron, and if you're going to talk about his debate performance, we should talk about the fact that I like Ron DeSantis because of the substance behind his campaign and what he's been doing as governor of Florida. I will concede that right now it's become pretty clear he's not a particularly charismatic guy. Yeah. Now, I promise I'm not just saying this as like a DeSantis surrogate. I don't get paid by the Ron DeSantis campaign to do this show. I don't know anyone working for Ron DeSantis' campaign. I wish I did. I wish I could talk to them. But I'll just say that I truly do believe that Ron DeSantis, his sort of awkwardness. Some people have actually speculated that he's autistic, which is, I think, a little out of left field, but it is a thing that made its way into Politico at one point. I would say this about Ron DeSantis' awkwardness and absolutely undeniable relative lack of charisma, particularly when compared to someone like Trump. Ron DeSantis is a dad. He's a dad. He's a suburban Republican dad. And I knew so many guys like him growing up. A lot of my friends' dads were like Ron DeSantis is. There are video clips of him talking to voters in Iowa saying, me and my wife are in bed at 11 p.m. We're pumpkins. We're asleep. I don't stay up that late. I just want to, hang out with my kids the next day. I take care of my kids. He's got this beautiful family. He doesn't cheat on them with porn stars. He's in contrast to Trump. Ron DeSantis is just a very normal guy. He doesn't love what almost nobody except Donald Trump, who has sort of boundless energy, especially for someone of his age, nobody loves, which is campaigning to be president of the United States. It's not a fun thing to do.
No.
And I think it's obviously wearing on him at this point. His debate performance was not terrible. I think he had some good moments when he got a little more ornery with the moderators and some of the other candidates. I actually think he was at his best, and he should try to take that dad energy and push it forward. I really recommend Ron DeSantis saying something to the effect in a future debate of like, look, if you want the most charismatic, smooth talking candidate, vote for Donald Trump, or better yet, vote for Barack Obama. Remember how that turned out. You can always vote for the guy who talks the smoothest. But if you want the guy who has done the most things that you want them to do as a conservative, the things that you care about, please vote for me, because I am the only person on this stage who has gone out of my way to take the heat, whether it was COVID or getting rid of do-nothing district attorneys in Miami-Dade County who won't enforce the fucking law, which he did do. He disbarred a district attorney, a Soros-funded attorney. Whether it's getting critical race theory and gender ideology, grooming bullshit out of schools, Ron DeSantis has always been the guy to take the plunge and do a high-risk campaign that isn't just rhetorically high risk the way somebody like Vivek's is, but actually do high risk policy and governance. He is a governor in the truest sense of the word, and he's a dad. He's got strong dad energy, and I like that about him. And I actually do genuinely appreciate it on some level, but will acknowledge that his debate performance was, I wouldn't call it sleepy. I think he was trying, but it was a little awkward. It was stilted. He isn't great at modulating his body language with his voice. He's just not a natural politician, I don't think, which I find kind of appealing. But I know that when you're running for president, you want to be more like Barack Obama and Donald Trump and be overtly charismatic. Those two figures, Obama and Trump, being charismatic to a sort of legendary degree. So DeSantis is still alive as far as I'm concerned. I'm holding out hope that he can, as a strong DeSantis supporter, I'm holding out hope that he can perform better in future debates, eventually be in a debate with fewer candidates where he's able to be a little bit less distracted by, I think, the sheer amount of stuff that's going on around him, which, by the way, at one point included Vivek sort of shooing at him with his hand from off camera. Yeah, I don't know if people saw this, but Vivek was sort of like gesturing towards him like, what are you doing at one point? And DeSantis, to his credit, just kind of kept talking. But DeSantis, I think he had a fine debate performance that was a little stilted. He'll live to fight another day, but he didn't do what he really ought to have done with Trump being absent, which is slam his fist down and say, I am the second place candidate, and here's why. And here's why I am the only one on this stage that can defeat Donald Trump and then defeat Joe Biden. And he didn't do anything to that effect.
No, I certainly share your instincts. Like, I want someone to be president who doesn't want to be president. Because the people who have the quality of wanting to be president are probably people I don't want to have that job. Now, obviously, Ron DeSantis wants to be president, but you're right. This is like, he almost has this discomfort, reluctance with what it takes to not be the president, but to get the job. Like, getting the job is the worst part of the job, right? And I find it endearing about Ron DeSantis that he doesn't seem like he's very comfortable. Like, he doesn't want to have the Donald Trump throng of people all shouting his name. Like, he does seem more substantive than that. I did see, and maybe this is a weird cut and you can debunk me on this, but wasn't it, I think it was a weird moment he had when the candidates were asked to raise their hands if they would pardon Donald Trump. And he kind of hesitated and took the temperature of the room.
He looked at the other candidates. Yeah.
So that's not great. Now, I don't know. It's an interesting question how I feel about pardoning Trump. I haven't really thought much about that. But
but DeSantis hadn't either. It's a really hard thing to do. that was a bad moment for him. It was obviously his weakest moment of the debate. He literally looked at other candidates before. He kind of peeks around, and then eventually he sort of raises his hand. But he also did say during that segment, like, you're kind of treating us like school children. I actually thought that was one of his better moments when he was like, this raise your hand thing really doesn't work. You're asking me a very tough question and asking me to raise my hand at the moment without getting all the facts, without putting any thought into it. Like, whether you would pardon Donald Trump depends on so many different things about how that prosecution goes. It's an incredibly tough question. I understand journalists are supposed to kind of needle these candidates and get them to differentiate from one another. But yeah, obviously you can't do that. If a question like that is asked, you have to decide whether you're keeping your hand down or putting it up in the moment and not sort of weakly put it up, halfway through the question.
And maybe his better move was not to raise his hand and attempt to clarify and say something like that, to be like, well, are we talking about one of the state prosecutions? Or are we talking about one of the federal prosecutions? Would I actually have the power to do that? Are we talking about the one where Donald Trump was caught, I don't know, having classified documents as the reading material for the people who used his bathroom? Or are we talking about Alvin Bragg's completely fabricated case that basically has already been cleared by the feds? So I think that maybe is an opportunity missed for him and instead turned into a bad moment. But all in all, I mean, yeah, I think you're right. He's not making the case of, I'm the person who can do this. And you know what his best case should be is the guy who's leading now, he already lost to Joe Biden once. Do you really want to give that guy another shot, or you want to try somebody who's got real substance, who's had real results in Florida for people, and those people have overwhelmingly reelected him? I think that's the case he really needs to be putting out there more forcefully.
Yeah, and I don't know if his plan is, because he could do that so much more forcefully if it was just him and Trump on that stage.
Right.
I think that he would perform significantly better, but I hope he doesn't have a survive and advance mentality. He's going to have to knock some people out and have good moments before then, because my mentality is this. If Ron DeSantis is polling at 15% in January, he's going to lose the Iowa caucus, he's going to lose the New Hampshire primary, and Donald Trump is going to win all 50 states and become the Republican nominee. If he's polling at 30% in January, and he maybe comes in second in Iowa, or even third, or maybe even fourth. But if he's at 30% nationally, and some other candidates start to drop out of the race at that time, as always happens when votes are actually being cast and money is running thin in these campaigns, he would stand a chance of getting into a one-on-one battle with Trump, where I think that contrast is so much easier to draw.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, frankly, I think the most interesting debate at this point would be Christie, Haley, DeSantis, and Trump. I think that's probably what I would want to see. I kind of feel like Vivek, I get everything that I would want from Vivek out of DeSantis. I appreciate Vivek's presence in the race on some level. He's not an irritating candidate because he's at least interesting, but I'm Team DeSantis. As far as I'm concerned, everything Vivek can do, DeSantis can do better. The way that everything Asa Hutchinson can do, Chris Christie can do better. And everything an establishment figure like Mike Pence can do, Nikki Haley can do better. I think if you had as far as I'm concerned, Haley's your establishment candidate. DeSantis is your kind of does it all candidate, kind of generalist candidate, can appeal to the Trumpers, can appeal to some extent to the anti-Trumpers because he is not Trump, and can appeal to the establishment. Chris Christie is your anti-Trumper, and Trump is Trump. Those four candidates to me speak to the factions in the Republican Party right now. Trump, anti-Trump, sort of general establishment. Trump is whatever, I'll deal with him as I have to. And then you're sort of Ron DeSantis, I think, is a very unique candidate who appeals to all of these factions. And that's one of the reasons that I like him so much, and that I am supporting him. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. That's pretty much all I've got on the debate. It was not particularly entertaining. It was a little dispiriting as somebody who, for really the first time in my adult life has really picked a guy. I mean, in the past, I was a Democrat. I was supporting Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard to some extent last time around in the Democratic primary, but they had no shot at all. So I just kind of, it was kind of a joke. So, I have my guy, and he wasn't particularly inspiring last week. So I'm hoping to see more out of DeSantis as a DeSantis supporter. And I know that you're going libertarian. I heard that comedian Dave Smith is out of the race.
I have no idea what's going on. All I know is I'm going to show up on voting day, and I know which button I'm pushing. Yeah. I mean, who knows? Like, if it were Vivek and maybe DeSantis, that's worth a vote. I've always said that because I trust me, I have many people who talk to me about throwing away my vote on libertarians. And my opinion on that has always been that I thought it was the root of democracy to vote with people who are most aligned with your interests. And that's the people who are most aligned with my interests, no matter what their prospects of winning. But DeSantis, Ramaswamy, they're close enough for me to be able to swallow that vote without feeling bad about myself.
Yeah.
Trump, I just can't do it. I just can't do it.
And there's always the question of like, if you lived in Ohio and you knew somehow that your vote would be the one deciding vote, whereas, you know, I'm not going to dox Ben right now, but for all we know, he lives in California and his vote doesn't really matter particularly, you know, like
I live in a state where my vote probably doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. As do I. So that narrows it down a little bit for you doxers out there. But, but you know, it's like, I do get that as someone who wrote in Tulsi Gabbard's name in 2020. I've definitely gotten my fair share of throwing my vote away, or a lot of people who told me I surrogate voted for Trump by not voting for Biden, which has become a big Democratic line in recent years, that if you don't vote for the Democrat, you're voting for Trump. But in any case, that's all we've got.
Make me feel bad about how I feel. Yeah. Like, not you, but like other people. I'm just not going to feel bad about it because one, it's pretty inconsequential. But two, like I get to do this. I get to do dumb shit. We all get to do dumb shit, and voting is just a dumb shit thing that we do.
Vote your conscience, folks. Vote your conscience. So that's what we've got on the debate. There's something else I want to talk about today. We talked on the last episode about sort of a timeline for wokeness and the culture war, topics that we've generally covered a lot on this show. But there's something I want to do today on this show that I don't know if I've done before, which is dive into the fact that not everything that's taken place with the culture war took place between 2012 and 2020, like I sort of said on the last episode. I think all of the biggest actual parts of the culture war itself did, in a way, take place during that period. And you can make the case that this country was a fairly stable, politically unified country up until around 2012, where nobody would have questioned how many genders there were and things like that. Up until around that time, we all would have been on pretty much the same page. Is rioting bad? Are police the good guys? You know, that sort of thing. So I think that it is important to remember the before times and how relatively recently they were. I don't want to discount that, but I do want to do something on this show that I think it's incumbent upon me to do as someone who identified very strongly with the intellectual dark web for a long time. People who've been watching this show long enough know that I come from the disaffected liberal wing of the technically not Republican Party, I'm an independent, but of the sort of conservative movement, if you will, at this point, of the right, which I definitely am more or less a party to at this point. I come from this world where people would tell you, like, why couldn't we just stop the train in 2012 or 2011 and stay there? Everything before that, the Democrats were always the good guys. And, it was always good to be on the right side of history when it comes to, expanding rights and always sticking up for the little guy. I want to talk about a theory that has been popularized, particularly on the new right and sort of the online right in recent years. People like Orrin McIntyre, friend of the show, people on the sort of dissident right, the reactionary right, a guy named Christopher Caldwell, who wrote a book called Age of Entitlement that I'm working on reading right now. They all have this theory. And Chris Rufo, the obviously very famous activist who worked closely with Ron DeSantis, they're all a party to a theory that you can actually sort of you can trace the DNA for the culture war on some level. Even if it isn't the culture war itself, you can trace the DNA for the culture war all the way back to at least the 1960s and the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation that was passed, including the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968. So we get to the spiciest part of the show, which is the Civil Rights Act was bad, actually. No, I'm kidding. It's not that simple because obviously the case that is generally made about this is that it was a righteous cause, obviously, to fight against racism that was taking place, particularly in the Deep South in the 1960s in the United States, because Black people in the United States had very legitimate grievances at the time with pretty brutal racism that was happening. So no, this isn't as simple as saying the Civil Rights Acts were bad, but there is an argument that has been made in recent years that I think is worth talking about, especially as people try to contextualize the culture war and answer the question, how did it happen so quickly? It feels like it transported out of another dimension in 2014. I think it's incumbent upon us to look back at this idea of things sort of starting to some extent in the 1960s and ask the question, what were some of the perhaps unintended consequences of the civil rights movement, of that legislation, of essentially taking freedom of association and doing away with it in so that you could bring in essentially legal structures that said you are not allowed to discriminate under any circumstances against an ever growing list of aggrieved parties. And Ben, you're an attorney and are probably more well educated on this topic than I am, so I'll throw it over to you. But I want to talk about this for a little bit because, to some extent, for me, it's a mea culpa. It's me saying for years I've always said it transported out of another dimension. I don't know where the fuck this wokeness came from. And I definitely think it's incumbent upon me and people like me to not do what, I love him, but Sam Harris has been doing for many, many years, which is saying like everything was fine until 2014, until Trump came along. And I love Sam. I think he's a very smart guy, and I think he's done some really great stuff. But, I think it's incumbent upon people like me from this sort of intellectual dark web world to say conservatives were right before 2014. It's not like conservatives all of a sudden were right about these things, that you actually need to look back several decades and ask yourself the question, what mistakes were being made in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, and yes, maybe even in the 60s.
Yeah. So there's a concept to think about, and I think it's best. I'm just rereading Robert Heinlein's book, "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress." I don't know if you've read any Heinlein. He also wrote "Stranger in a Strange Land." That's where we got the term grok, if you're familiar with that. Anyway, going off. Anyway, Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Basically, the plot is you've got people who are shipped to the moon. They live in these harsh conditions. They decide to secede and make their own government. And so the part of this book, I'm just about to finish it, but kind of the philosopher king of the book, they're trying to write their own constitution. And this philosopher king character is saying what this document should be is all the things that government cannot do. Is we need to tell them all the negative things instead of what we eventually started doing, again, starting in about the 60s, is starting granting positive rights. So the difference between negative and positive rights is important. Negative rights are clearly easily defined. The government shall not what? Abridge the freedom of speech, abridge the freedom of the press, abridge freedom of association. All of those things are easy to do because when the government does it, we can easily say that they did it and they can stop fucking doing it. When we start granting positive rights that you can have this and you can have that, they really can metastasize into, well, if I have the right to this, then I need this right to make that right more usable, generally accessible, all of these things. And they grow and they grow and they grow with no limiting principle because they're not negative rights. Negative rights are easily defined. They don't normally grow outside of their scope. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and you and I talked, I think may have been off camera, or at least off the air. That's a weird phrase to use in this context, but of the air, it's like Rand Paul took some shit when he went to run for president, I think in 2016, saying he wouldn't have survived the Civil Rights Act. Well, that's actually a really simple proposition for someone who's more libertarian minded, is with the exception of common carriers, and I can discuss what that is, but for the most part, if I want to have a restaurant and I say I only want to serve white men, the market is going to take care of my bigotry because I'm limiting my market. So if you believe in the market as much as, Austrian economists like his dad, Ron Paul Wood, I'm sure he associates with that school. Like, the market will take care of those types of things, and we don't need government to tell us which types of things we can and cannot do in those situations where the natural incentives is to be as open to other people as possible.
Yeah, it's kind of a third rail to speak poorly of the civil rights acts of 1964 and 1968 and the civil rights movement, in large part because, and this is part of what I want to talk about, that sort of became the new mythology of the United States, almost like our new founding story. You were taught in school, yes, you learn a little bit about how noble George Washington was for fighting the British and winning our independence, but really you were taught that like being on the right side of history means, being the people who marched with Martin Luther King and not these backwoods hicks who, didn't want the government telling them that they could free associate. And yes, that would mean telling a black man not to sit at their restaurant, ugly as that might be. This sort of mythology and morality and culture that was born out of this, it essentially became what we now know as victimhood culture, which metastasized into political correctness, which metastasized into wokeness. Because what we said in the 1960s with the passage of this legislation is there's now a legal structure that creates a pie. And you can only get a piece of that pie if you are one of these victimized groups, if you're an aggrieved group. So it started off mostly Black people, women, other ethnic minorities, maybe religious minorities. There was the old saying, race, color, creed, sex, etc.
Suspect classes is the word
Yeah.
we use.
Yeah. So, and of course, absolutely, you do not have access to that pie. You are in the out group if you are a straight white male. And nobody would have even known the word cis back then, but is cis straight white male, whatever you want to say. It almost makes me want to vomit even saying that word on the show.
Really
and I
hate
usually
that.
I usually don't. I'm just going to fucking say it. If you're a normal straight white male, if you're a classic, a straight white male classic, okay, like classic Coke, a natal straight white male.
That's right.
If you are one of those fucking things, like these two guys on this show, you do not get a slice of the victimhood pie. And so you create an in-group and an out-group. That's not good. That's gotten very ugly in recent years, the way that straight white men are often treated and looked upon, and how it's become essentially acceptable to be bigoted towards them because there's no legal consequences. Why not?
Right.
So that was born out of that, creating that in-group and that out-group. And again, you create this sort of oppression arms race. Everybody wants a piece of that pie. Once people realize, like, oh my God, I can sue people for not wanting to associate with me or give me spoils, whether it's a job or housing, or it could be relatively simple things like that, but it could be something like, a position on a board of directors, or admission to a college that I'm not qualified to go to. I can sue them and legally, put legal consequences on them for that. And so again, you create this legal structure and this culture of victimhood, and the fact that there's laws undergirding that has led to basically where we are now. Because as the arms race, as the oppression arms race that I was describing, metastasized and advanced and became bigger and bigger, more and more people wanted a piece of the pie, and eventually you get to a point where you can have a straight white male who wants a piece of the pie, and all of a sudden he's trans, or all of a sudden he's non-binary,
or at
right?
least non-binary.
Yeah, you get these invented classes of people that, and look, I've had Buck Angel on the show. I know there are some people who have gender identity disorder. It's an actual thing, but that exploded an awful lot once it got to the point where this had metastasized to the point where you got what are basically known as trans trenders. So you have these sort of invented classes that were inevitable because, again, who wouldn't want a piece of that pie? I'll admit, I've been tempted at times to just be like, what if I just go to work one day and say my pronouns are they, them? Is anyone going to fuck with me? Is anyone going to fire me? But I'm a little too proud to do it. But look, have I had the temptation? Of course I have.
Well, and that brings up such a great point, because a lot of the underlying, like, what a lot of these laws did in attempting to create this equal society without discrimination was they created the opportunity for, well, opportunism. So I, again, mentioned many times, I'm a lawyer. I read a lot of the opinions that come out of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals for the circuit that I'm within. And it amazes me when I started doing this. I've been doing this for about 6-7 years now. It amazes me how many are employment cases, and how many of those employment cases are all these discrimination cases, either unlawful firings or someone got promoted and they didn't get promoted and someone else did. Like, once you create these different entitlement classes, you create all these opportunities for not only genuinely aggrieved people to receive recompense for being, discriminated against, which is very shitty. But you create the opportunity for all these people who now belong to some type of protected group to be able to claim grievance whenever anything adverse happens that someone like you or I would never be able to claim grievance, and we would know exactly why it happened to us. So that is just another consequence of government intervention here, is you've created this opportunity for people to take advantage of what is something that has a noble goal. And if only genuinely agreed people did it, nobody would have a problem, really. But you've just got opportunists who jump on that, and that's why government doing these things is a bad idea.
Yeah, you create a grievance industry, a grievance grift that can be taken advantage of. There is no better example There are maybe one or two better examples that I can actually think of, but Al Sharpton is the first person that comes to mind. And the other people I'm thinking of that are even better examples, no one is better than Jussie Smollett. I mean, Jussie Smollett was the
Mm.
ultimate example of someone who, because everyone knows it, like there's nobody even denies it at this point. CNN can't even deny it. Jussie Smollett tried to trade on his sexuality and race for money. He wanted more money for the job he was doing and to basically needle them with the fact that he was the victim of a racist, homophobic crime and that he needed to be seen as a sympathetic figure and given all the money he was asking for. People forget this. Jussie Smollett didn't like that he wasn't getting paid enough. He was getting paid like $40,000 for every couple of weeks that he was filming Empire, which is a lot of money, and it wasn't enough for this supporting role he had on the show. So he orchestrated a fake hate crime. Jussie Smollett is the ultimate example of grievance industry, in his case, thankfully, exposed. And it rarely does get exposed. With Al Sharpton, people forget that Al Sharpton made up fake rape accusations in the 1990s. Yep. He's still allowed to have his fucking show on MSNBC. This has been going on longer, though. Al Sharpton's a good example, than the past 10 years. Yep. Creatures like Al Sharpton, and he is a fucking creature, exist because of what was done in the 1960s for what you can absolutely argue are very noble reasons, because Black people were being treated very, very poorly, and nobody would ever deny that in the Deep South in the 1960s. But the argument that I think is made when you talk about the age of entitlement, the sort of creation of a second constitution, of a second founding mythology, of a victim culture, a culture that is no longer about patriotism and honor and responsibility, this victim culture, it left us in a state where the victimhood became the ultimate virtue, and you get the creation of creatures like Al Sharpton, who are the sort of basis, the template for creatures like Jussie Smollett and Kamala Harris and all these other people who have just, and to some extent, a much lesser extent, people like Barack Obama, who everyone knows leveraged his race to be elected over Hillary Clinton in 2008, and to sort of sermonize people in this nation, especially when he was saying things like, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. So what you have with all of these people like Al Sharpton, to some extent Barack Obama, like hilariously Jussie Smollett, is the creation of a victimhood-based culture, of a rights-based culture, a positive rights-based culture that takes us away from what America was, which was a place where you had to trade on your responsibility, your honor, your patriotism, your loyalty to family, to some extent to employer, because people actually took some pride in their work back then, and to country. These things were supplanted by this new mythology where the civil rights movement, for as much as it may have been justified on some level, what it created was a mythology for people where they believe you always want to be on the right side of history. You always have to be pro-rights, for the expansion of positive rights. And if you're against that, you're the bad guy. And that's why we see people now who, until it became this propagandized thing about rights, they would never have said there was more than two genders. They would have had common sense. But once it became a thing where the media would say that anyone who's against, certain parts of gender ideology, like Ron DeSantis, banning things in Florida, they're passing anti-trans rights legislation. That's how it's always framed in those articles. That's what those headlines say. And because it's anti-rights, anytime you see anti-rights, a bunch of people with liberal DNA, political DNA, they get triggered and they go, I don't want to be that. Whatever that is, I don't want to be it. So, okay, there's 80 genders. Fine. And it's really sad. And a big part of today's show is just me admitting, even though I have liberal political DNA, I absolutely do, that, you can draw some of this stuff back several decades. And to some extent, and Chris Rufo, I think, is trying to do this, I think is kind of his ultimate goal. You do have to roll back some of that stuff, especially because now you don't need the Civil Rights Act to keep people from kicking Black people out of their restaurants. If anything, if anyone's fomenting a race war, it's the woke people who would definitely kick white people and straight white men out of spaces and denigrate them and try to oppress them. The reins of oppression are being flipped. And if anything, all people on the right want is for us to go back to a state of let everyone play by the same set of rules and not have this oppression arms race, everyone reaching for the pie that has led us to the point that we're at now.
And So I think that legal history is helpful, and we're getting close to the end of the show. So I'll just quickly reference a couple other things. But the influence of higher education and academia in this story really can't be ignored. I highly recommend Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's book Critical Theories, or Cynical Theories is the name of it. Also, not Charles, Douglas Murray, his book The Madness of Crowds. There's an interlude chapter about how kind of Marxism had to find a new group other than like proletariat, other than class politics, to start to kind of keep its own narrative. And so what they latched onto was identity politics. And that's how you get like the Kimberly Crenshaws of the world. So both of those sources, I think people should look. But the promulgation of racism and sexism as reducing everything to power plus prejudice is another one of these main points. And now we're at the point today that when we remove the intent part of discrimination, the prejudice part of that equation drops out, and now we've just like all these problematic relationships are because of power dynamics, and that's another story that's going on in this background. And then you've got the creation of academia not being about finding the truth, about educating students, but it's about activism. DeSantis, as we mentioned earlier in the show, like has done a great job in Florida trying to curb some of this. But I think that this story is incomplete. I mean, it's incomplete just because we're giving it 20 minutes at the end of our show. But in addition to that legal history, this positive rights stuff, I think looking at what happened in academia from about the 60s, 70s until today is really important.
Yeah. This is a story we'll definitely talk about more on the show. It's something that I want to dive into more. I am reading The Age of Entitlement right now, which is the book that is often recommended on this topic if you're looking to learn more about it, kind of how the 1960s and the civil rights movement influenced victimhood culture, which became political correctness, which becomes wokeness. Again, Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. It sounds like I'm cutting an ad for it right now. I have a copy of the book. I haven't even read it yet, though, so I'm not associated with the Ron DeSantis campaign nor Christopher Caldwell and his publisher. But
free advertising today on the Veritas podcast.
Free advertising for stuff that I do like and that I think more people should understand. Because if you think that this stuff transported out of another dimension in 2014, you won't have the right idea for how to fight back against it. You won't understand that it isn't just a moral question; it is a legal question. It does require going on offense if you are in the government to actually peel back some of the legal infrastructure for wokeness that allows it to, to use the law as a cudgel against its enemies. Because at the end of the day, politics is so often about friends and enemies. But we'll definitely cover this topic more on the show. It deserves a lot more time, as Ben was saying, than just these last 20 minutes of the show. But I don't know if you guys can tell, it's a Friday night here. We appreciate you being with us on this Friday night edition of the Veritas podcast. We do have to cut it here for now, but we'll be with you again in a couple of weeks. If you're on iTunes, please leave a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time on the Veritas Podcast.